Part 3 of Chapter 5 begins dealing with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. This was a very critical period in this time of the development of civil rights, as well as in the change process that was going on in the United States. Many issues were being challenged as to whether or not they were providing sufficient equal participation on the part of all citizens of the United States. The Brown decision did not end discrimination. And in fact, the civil rights movement was built slowly, in that it was the March on Washington in 1963, of which there is a picture of at the beginning of this module. The march, however, is an important one because it required individual participation in civil rights. This individual participation really made little sense according to the rationality principle of the 5 principles of politics. After all, participation would be costly in terms of time and money, and in the case of civil rights marchers, even one's health or life was in danger. There are plenty of pictures of the early 60s in which civil rights marchers were attacked by law enforcement and other people. However, as the text goes on to argue that these individuals participated in civil rights marches because participation yielded an experiential benefit. In other words, they had a chance to feel like they were bringing about a change, and that they were becoming a force in the collective action process. In the 1960s, of course, the U.S. Congress got into the act, further extending the government's role in protecting the rights of racial minorities by passing the 19 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The question is, what was in it for them? And what they realized, based upon watching the marches, that African Americans could and would provide a substantial voting bloc that they could take advantage of personally and collectively. The next 2 slides, this one and the next one, documents the civil rights movement. What I found interesting in my analysis of this, that with each judicial and legal action, there appeared to be a political action as well. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education, i.e. a judicial action, we then see a political action dealing with the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. Later, judicial courts, federal courts integrate the University of Alabama, followed by then a legal action of the Civil Rights Act, which created a commission to monitor actions. And of course, we see President Eisenhower sending troops to Little Rock. Finally, there is the political action that involves a very key individual in this whole process, Martin Luther King, who became president of the Southern Christian Leadership. With the continued political action, we begin seeing the formation of institutions that are, again, part of that political process that establish a number of institutions, policies, and procedures that would help facilitate the civil rights action. We see the development of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which orders desegregation of buses, trains, and terminals, which of course had been in the Civil Rights of 1875 overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. We see the Civil Rights Act passed covering voting, employment, public accommodations, and education, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that, of course, created a much more greater access to African Americans in the voting process. What Brown versus Board of Education did not provide the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act did. All of this, of course, was followed then by the war on poverty under the President Johnson's administration, which was a follow-up to the desires of President Kennedy's administration. Unfortunately, the assassination of President Kennedy was a very sad affair, but it also was, in path dependency, the punctuation of the equilibrium. While Kennedy was committed to bringing about change as it related to segregation, he was still faced with an uphill battle in Congress. With his death and with the actions by President Johnson, President Johnson was able to persuade Congress to act in passing the two Civil Rights Acts. As previously mentioned, Brown versus Board of Education did not bring about desegregation. In fact, there was mass resistance. In the case of after the Little Rock situation, as previously talked about with the state of Virginia, Governor Harry Byrd, who would later become Senator Harry Byrd, attempted to organize the South in resistance to Brown by setting up boards to determine what schools kids would attend. These pupil placement laws were then found to be unconstitutional. The case of Swan versus Charlotte School Board reaffirmed busing to support desegregation to minimize these placement boards. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did outlaw job discrimination. This was an important situation and an important point in Briggs versus Duke Power in 1974, where the Supreme Court put the onus on employers to show that employment policies that had discriminatory effect put the burden of proof on the employers. Thus, employers were responsible for ensuring that their employment policies were a business necessity, and that if the employer could not show that their policies were related to employment necessities, such as some of their testing, then they would be found and the policies were discriminating and, of course, were not allowed by the court. Later decisions by the court would evolve this process to where the burden was moved mainly from employers to more of the burden of the employee. The last case that I want to talk about as it relates to discrimination is a fairly current case dealing with Ledbetter versus Goodyear in 2007. This was a case that was brought by a woman who realized that she was being paid less for the same job that men were doing. However, in fear of losing her job, she waited until she retired to bring the case concerning discrimination based upon gender. The Supreme Court ruled that employers could not be sued under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 over race or gender pay if the claims were based upon decisions by employers more than 180 days before. Justice Alito held that the 5-justice majority that each paycheck received did not constitute a discrete discriminatory act. However, Congress overturned the court's decision by passing the Fair Pay Act in 2009, which basically indicated that every time a paycheck was issued, that the 180-day clock would re-begin. This concludes part 3 of chapter 5. In the next part, we will review different groups that have been discriminated in the past and the actions that were taken to help resolve them.